The Truman Doctrine is best represented in the joining of these two cartoons. The first cartoon illustrates the Soviet power expanding to the majority of the northeastern hemisphere to spread its ideology of communism, with the American power standing helpless and weak. The second cartoon illustrates the Truman Doctrine's effects. The Soviet Union is now standing helpless and weak, while the American superpower pursues its self-interest in competing with the socialist ideology of the Soviet Union, expanding its liberal capitalism to much of the world. This is the Truman Doctrine. In essence, it was bribes offered by the American sphere of influence to many countries, especially in Europe, to stop the spread of communism in those countries. This represents the American ideology of liberalism, self-interest, competition, and the creation of allies in Europe, all while containing the spread of the Soviet Union's ideology. This clashed with the Soviet ideology, which was attempting to expand to many countries around the Soviet Union in order to create a much larger superpower, filled with communism, not American liberal capitalism.
The creation of NATO is only one part of two illustrations of the conflicting ideologies. Created in order to solidify the American sphere of influence, the U.S. founded international alliances based on mutual protection in which an attack on one ally would be considered an attack on the entire superpower. The United States led NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization founded in Washington in 1949. Members include Canada, the United Kingdom, France, who withdrew in 1966, West Germany, Italy, Norway, and others. The creation of NATO marked a significant pursuing of national interest by the United States, in accordance to liberal principles. The U.S. was pursuing self-interest in marking allegiances and protecting themselves in the act of doing so. They were competing with the Soviet Union for allegiances and expanding their ideology of capitalism to each country that signed the treaty, if they were not already in the liberal capitalist country. The photo for the creation of NATO shows each country involved in the organization at the table in the act of signing the treaty in 1949. It illustrates the cooperation of each country in NATO, something integral to its viability.
The arms race is best depicted in this graph of arms versus years of the Cold War. The red curve represents the Soviet Union, while the blue curve represents the United States. According to the graph, the United States' nuclear armament number rose significantly in the beginning of the 1950s and stayed fairly constant until the 1970s. The Soviet Union's arms rose significantly in the 1980s, and each side's numbers decreased due to the START treaty signed. The arms race represents conflicts between two ideologies extremely well. The U.S. liberal ideology concerned itself with arming themselves heavily, as a strong military is a major aspect of a liberal capitalist society. By pursuing self-interest and competing with the Soviet Union for nuclear arms, the United States armed themselves well. Eventually, many years later, the Soviet Union perfected the method of nuclear weapon creation, and their stockpiles rose dramatically, much higher than the U.S. stockpiles. This was due to the need for protection. The Soviet Union had a history of invasion, so protection was a major factor in its national interest. Besides, how else is a communist country supposed to spread its ideology by force if necessary, if they do not have the nuclear weapons needed for the scare factor?
The Warsaw Pact is the second installment in a two-part struggle of competing ideologies. Created in response to NATO, the Soviet Union and communist states signed the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance in 1955, aka the Warsaw Pact. It promised mutual protection and respect for sovereignty of communist countries and used the countries between the Soviet Union and Western Europe who adopted the U.S. liberal ideology as a buffer zone. The Warsaw Pact allowed the Soviet Union to invade Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 in order to maintain that buffer zone. The buffer zone was known as the Iron Curtain and represented a separation of liberal and communist ideology. The Warsaw Pact versus NATO is a clear struggle between the two competing ideologies. Each was created to make allies and protect the member countries, all while attempting to expand to other countries. The countries that were included in the Warsaw Pact all observed and practiced communism, strengthening the Soviet sphere of influence. The image of the Warsaw Pact represents it well. Each member country is riding on a tank, advancing towards the reader. It illustrates that the communist powers were expanding and all the other countries included in the picture were allies with military power.
The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 depicts resistance against the Soviet communist ideology well. In the fall of 1956, Hungarian peoples revolted against the Stalinist government, battling state police and Soviet troops. 2 weeks later, a new democratic government was established. The American liberal capitalist democratic system had inspired the Hungarian peoples to adopt it, revolting against the in the Soviet Union's ideology. Very quickly, though, Soviet forces invaded Hungary again, reversed the government by excessive force, and a clear message of irreversibility of Soviet communism in the Soviet sphere of influence was issued. This picture of Stalin's massive statue, roped and pulled down by citizens, is a shocking, effective message that the Hungarian peoples no longer accepted the communist government. This shows a clear rejection of communism and the adoption of liberalism, which the Soviet Union responded to with extreme force.
This image of the Berlin Wall, which was literally a physical separation of the two conflicting ideologies, represents the conflict well, a physical wall separating two people who are trying to communicate, with the left side or western side free of guards and the eastern side, the Soviet side, guarded. The Berlin Wall was erected to physically divide Western Germany, which identified with the American power, the liberal capitalism ideology, and Eastern Germany, which was under communist Soviet Union rule. It was erected to stop the flow of East Germans to the West German liberal side, in order to guard their ideology, which was being exerted on the east side. The Soviet Union was not at all receptive in any encroachment or capitalism or democracy, attempting to expand and guard their communist ideology. The Berlin Wall represents tension between the two ideologies extremely well, a physical boundary separating each superpower, with the Western liberal side having a NATO protection, a democratic system, economic opportunity for all, and the Eastern Soviet side stopping anyone from crossing into Western Germany. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the culmination of the American policy of containment and the Soviet tactic of expansionism. It was the climax of the Cold War and the conflict between the American liberal ideology and the Soviet Marxist-Lenin ideology. The Cuban Missile Crisis essentially began when Fidel Castro was put into power by the Cuban citizens, and he proceeded to buy oil from the Soviet powers. Soon, the United States organized and commenced a Bay of Pigs invasion against Cuba, using its own escapees to attack, which failed massively. The American government became unwilling to trade with Cuba and imposed economic, commercial, and financial embargoes on it, while the Soviet power provided Cuba with financial aid, a strong trade relationship, and a modernization to its military. The U.S. found out that the Soviet missiles were being shipped to Cuba and set up a blockade around Cuba, and the world was brought to the brink of a nuclear war. Finally, Kennedy agreed to decommission their missile bases in Turkey if the Soviet power decommissioned their bases in Cuba. Ideological conflict is apparent as the U.S. was pursuing self-interest in stopping the Soviet expansion, stopping the spread of the rival socialist ideology. The simple cartoon of John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev sitting on missiles having an arm wrestling contest portrays the crisis perfectly. The conflict between the two superpowers over the missiles that support either of them. There is no clear winner in the cartoon, as there was not in the crisis. Eventually, both sides backed down.
SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, were a series of bilateral talks between the Soviet Union and the United States on the topic of arms reduction. There were two SALT talks, SALT I and SALT II, negotiated in Helsinki and Vienna respectively. In the talks, it was decided that each side would limit the number of arms producers and produce no modern arms for the time being. This was violated by the Soviet Union due to conflicting ideologies. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and was caught with a brigade on the way to Cuba. The Soviet Union thought it was necessary to produce arms no matter what, in order to spread their communist ideology by force if necessary, and to defend themselves from an American attack. The START Treaty, or Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, was a treaty negotiated on July 31, 1991, between the USSR and the United States. It was produced by the American power leader Ronald Reagan and was designed to dramatically reduce the amount of arms either superpower had. This treaty was viewed as a threat by the Soviet Union and was finally signed by both sides in 1991. START represents a struggle between the conflicting ideologies of liberal capitalism and Soviet communism due to the resistance it was met with from the Soviet side. They considered to be extremely one-sided and attempt at decreasing their expanding power via their arms available. The two images side by side represent the first signing of SALT I and the signing of START I, the original treaties. The juxtaposition of the United States liberal power against the Soviet Union communist power in each photo works to illustrate the conflicting ideologies.
This image compilation of the Iran-Contra affair is perfect. It's a compilation of all the newspaper headlines and magazine headlines that came out upon the world receiving the news of the affair. The images range from Oliver North stating, "I was authorized to do everything I did," to the New York Times headline of Bush pardoning those involved. When the truth came out about the affair, it was controversial, and these headlines illustrate that. The Iran-Contra affair was a clear illustration of the U.S. attempting to expand its sphere of influence by any means possible. In this case, it was selling arms to Iran, who would pay the US, who could give the money to the Nicaraguan rebels to help overthrow the communist Nicaraguan government. The US was strongly and illegally pursuing its national interest by expanding its sphere of influence, stopping the spread of communism in Nicaragua. The Soviet Union was simultaneously attempting to expand, and the US was attempting to stop that, especially in its own sphere of influence. The fall of the Berlin Wall was a significant event in the Cold War. It marked the lessening of tensions between the two conflicting ideologies of the two superpowers. The image of the Berlin Wall falling is of East German soldiers standing emotionless and straight, while the wall falls, and the people of the West German side are in a state of extreme excitement. This juxtaposes the two ideologies of the Cold War, the freedom-promoting liberal ideology of West Germany by the United States, and the strict communist rule of East Germany by the Soviet Union.